For nearly 2 years, the accepted belief in European security circles was that NATO would keep supporting Ukraine from a distance, supplying weapons, training crews, financing logistics, but stopping just short of the one step Moscow had defined as a red line. However, that belief no longer matches the battlefield map, the diplomatic calendar, or the language now coming out of Brussels, Wiesbaden, Warsaw, London, and Moscow. Because the line Russia once described as hypothetical has been approached so closely that the Kremlin is now speaking in the vocabulary of direct intervention, direct targets, and direct retaliation. And the truly unsettling part is not that this warning came eventually. It is that it came after NATO had already built much of the architecture Russia feared most: command networks, training hubs, high-readiness formations, and an irreversible political path that places Ukraine inside the alliance's strategic bloodstream even before formal membership. That is why what happened next changed the entire equation overnight. Because once Moscow declared that any foreign military contingent or infrastructure in Ukraine would be treated as a legitimate target, the war stopped looking like a frozen front and started looking like the opening phase of something much larger. The images now emerging across Europe give that warning a physical shape. German troops in Lithuania are building the framework for a permanent brigade presence. Canadian forces in Latvia are scaling a battle group into a brigade. NATO's Baltic Sentry patrols began after undersea infrastructure incidents in January 2025. Eastern Sentry followed in September 2025 after Russian drones and aircraft violated the airspace of Estonia, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Norway, Poland, and Romania. What appears on the screen as routine reinforcement is seen from Moscow as a tightening ring. What looks defensive from Brussels looks pre-positioned from the Kremlin. And that difference in perception is precisely where strategic crises begin. The immediate trigger came on February 2, 2026. Russia's foreign ministry, citing Sergei Lavrov, stated that any deployment of foreign military units, facilities, warehouses, or other Western infrastructure in Ukraine would be regarded as foreign intervention, posing a direct threat to Russia's security. It added that all foreign military contingents, including German ones, if deployed in Ukraine, would become legitimate targets for the Russian armed forces. This was not an isolated outburst. It came as European capitals debated post-war security guarantees, deterrence forces, and the possibility that British and French-led formations could help secure a settlement. One day later, on February 3rd, the Institute for the Study of War assessed that the Kremlin was again rejecting Western security guarantees as unacceptable and using this rhetoric as part of a broader cognitive warfare effort. By February 25th, ISW went further, arguing that Moscow was running a reflexive control campaign to manipulate Western decisions and fracture what some officials had started calling a coalition of the willing. In plain terms, the Kremlin was trying to make NATO governments hesitate before they crossed the last visible threshold. To understand why this matters, it is necessary to move below the headline level and into the machinery of modern deterrence. NATO is no longer just transferring artillery shells and making political declarations. The alliance has created NATO Security Assistance and Training for Ukraine, or NSATU, based in Wiesbaden, Germany, with around 700 personnel coordinating assistance and training. It has used the prioritized Ukraine requirements list to channel more than $4 billion toward critical equipment purchases. It established the Joint Analysis, Training and Education Center in Bydgoszcz, Poland, to capture battlefield lessons and translate them into doctrine. And at the political level, it declared that Ukraine's path to membership is irreversible, while removing the Membership Action Plan requirement that once delayed accession. This is not symbolism. This is system integration. On the military side, the eastern flank has been transformed step by step since Crimea in 2014. 4 multinational battle groups became operational in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland by August 2017. 4 more battle groups were added in Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia after the full-scale invasion in March 2022, effectively doubling the forward presence from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. At the Madrid summit in June 2022, NATO agreed to scale some of these formations from battalion size toward brigade size where required. Germany's Lithuanian brigade is planned to reach up to 5,000 troops by 2027. Canada plans up to 2,200 troops in Latvia by 2026. NATO itself says the alliance now has 500,000 troops at high readiness across domains. For staff officers, these are force posture statistics. For Moscow, they are indicators of mobilized intent. And here the technical issue becomes more dangerous than the political slogan. Deterrence does not work only through declarations. It works through logistics nodes, ISR coverage, command and control resilience, stockpile depth, integrated air and missile defense, and the time-distance calculations that determine whether reinforcements arrive in days or in hours. CSIS has warned that Europe now faces a Russian campaign of sabotage, drone incursions, undersea infrastructure disruption, cyber operations, and nuclear saber-rattling, all designed to pressure NATO below the threshold of open war. It recommends increased intelligence sharing, stronger surveillance, armed drones on borders, relaxed rules for intercepting Russian drones, and even a 4+2 posture with 4 brigade combat teams and 2 regional headquarters on the eastern flank. That is not language used in a stable security environment. That is the grammar of pre-crisis preparation. The strategic implication is stark. Once NATO support evolves from external supply into embedded operational architecture, every future negotiation changes character. A peace guarantee backed by European troops is not just a diplomatic insurance policy. It is a military tripwire. A training command in Germany tied to Ukrainian force generation is not just bureaucracy. It is a war-sustaining backbone. A lessons-learned hub in Poland is not just an academic center. It is a doctrine engine converting battlefield adaptation into future combat power. And once those structures exist, Russia can no longer measure the war only by trench lines in Donetsk or missile strikes on substations. It has to measure it by the growth of a hostile military ecosystem on its frontier. That is why the phrase legitimate target matters so much. In military terminology, a target set is a category of objects approved for strike under a commander's operational design. Expanding that set to include foreign contingents, depots, and infrastructure inside Ukraine means expanding the risk envelope for any European power considering a deterrence mission. It tells Berlin that a logistics hub is no longer just support. It tells Paris that a reassurance force is no longer just symbolic. It tells London that a headquarters element could be interpreted as direct participation in combat. The Kremlin is not merely objecting, it is shaping escalation geometry before boots ever arrive. But there is another layer, and it may be the most important of all. CSIS argues that Russia's red lines have a mixed track record. Moscow warned in 2022 that supplying missiles to Ukraine would cross a line. Missiles arrived, tanks arrived, fighter jets arrived. NATO itself expanded with Finland and Sweden. The catastrophic retaliation that had been implied never fully materialized. From one perspective, this weakens Russian deterrence. From another, it increases the danger, because a state whose warnings repeatedly fail can eventually decide that credibility must be restored through a sharper demonstration. That is why every dismissed red line leaves a residue. The residue is pressure. This is where the broader geopolitical picture becomes impossible to ignore. NATO's eastern transformation is not happening in a vacuum. It is unfolding while Russia deepens security ties with Belarus, leverages Iranian drone design, draws ammunition and manpower support from North Korea, and rebuilds parts of its defense industrial base under sanctions. At the same time, European capitals are rearming, debating war economies, and discussing long-term basing models that would have sounded extraordinary only a few years ago. The security map of Europe is being redrawn not by treaties alone, but by depots, brigades, fiber optic cables, port access, and ammunition contracts. NATO describes these measures as defensive, proportionate, and consistent with international commitments. Formally, that is true. The Eastern battle groups are multinational, transparent, and designed to deter aggression rather than initiate it. Baltic Sentry was launched after critical undersea infrastructure incidents. Eastern Sentry came after repeated Russian airspace violations. Even support for Ukraine is framed as a response to Russia's invasion, not a campaign against Russia itself. Yet geopolitics is rarely governed by formal definitions. It is governed by how military capability appears when viewed through fear. And from Moscow's perspective, an irreversible path to Ukrainian membership, a 700-person NATO support command in Germany, a doctrine center in Poland, and 500,000 high-readiness troops across the alliance do not look like restraint. They look like encirclement by increments. That perception gap is what makes the current moment so unstable. ISW assesses that the Kremlin is using informational and psychological conditioning, what it calls Phase Zero, to prepare for a possible future conflict with NATO while avoiding one now. That means threats are serving several purposes at once. They deter, they divide, they test reactions, they pressure weak points in alliance politics, and above all, they seek to impose hesitation. If one European government begins to ask whether any post-war force must first receive Putin's implicit permission, Moscow has already achieved a strategic gain without moving a single battalion. The human dimension is often lost inside these abstractions, but it is the human dimension that decides whether deterrence holds. Somewhere in Wiesbaden, officers are matching equipment flows to Ukrainian operational requirements. Somewhere in Bydgoszcz, analysts are studying drone swarms, electronic warfare interference, and artillery survivability rates. Somewhere in Vilnius or Riga, families are watching new Allied formations arrive and asking whether more troops mean more safety or simply greater proximity to the next crisis. Somewhere in Moscow, planners are calculating how many minutes separate a launch decision from a radar track over the Western Military District. Strategic architecture may look impersonal. In reality, it is built out of fear, memory, and anticipation. And Europe has deep memory. The continent remembers what happens when revisionist powers test whether alliances are political theater or military fact. That is why historical analogy keeps returning, sometimes carelessly, but never accidentally. The deeper lesson is not that this moment is identical to 1939 or 1941. It is that security orders collapse slowly, then suddenly. First come the warnings, then the mobilization speeches, then the infrastructure hardening, then the force posture adjustments that are described as temporary until they become permanent. Then one night arrives when a move intended as deterrence is interpreted as preparation for attack. The psychological contest now underway is therefore as consequential as any missile exchange. Moscow wants European publics to believe that additional guarantees for Ukraine are reckless, escalatory, and possibly suicidal. NATO wants those same publics to believe that failing to provide guarantees would invite a larger war later. Both arguments are rooted in deterrence theory. Both exploit genuine fear. But only one side benefits if uncertainty paralyzes decision-making. That is why Russian claims about Third World War, nuclear conflict, and legitimate targets are not simply threats. They are instruments calibrated to penetrate democratic hesitation. There is also an operational reason the Kremlin reacted so sharply. Modern deterrence missions are never static. They begin with liaison officers, logistics planners, air defense detachments, and force protection teams. They expand into ammunition holding areas, hardened communications, tactical operations centers, runway access agreements, maintenance depots, medevac corridors, and layered ISR feeds connecting drones, satellites, and electronic intelligence. Once such a network is built, it creates what planners call persistence. Persistence means the supported force can absorb attrition, reconstitute faster, and keep its kill chain functioning under pressure. In Ukraine's case, that would mean faster targeting cycles, better battle damage assessment, more resilient sustainment, and shorter delays between battlefield losses and replacement capability. A NATO-backed deterrence presence would therefore not just protect a ceasefire line, it would reshape the operational tempo of any future war. That is why the phrase infrastructure in Ukraine may be more consequential than troops in Ukraine. Infrastructure is broad enough to include fuel depots, training ranges, air defense radars, rail transfer points, satellite uplinks, maintenance workshops, and command posts. In Russian targeting doctrine, dual-use infrastructure is often treated as militarily relevant the moment it supports combat endurance. Reuters noted that Moscow's February 2 statement did not only warn against soldiers, it warned against facilities, warehouses, and other Western infrastructure. That wording was deliberate. It means the Kremlin is signaling that escalation could begin long before a Western brigade ever appears on Ukrainian soil in full strength. A warehouse can be struck before a battalion deploys. A headquarters element can be targeted before a formal mission flag is raised. That compresses warning time and expands ambiguity. And ambiguity favors the side most willing to weaponize surprise. Russian operations in this war have repeatedly mixed cruise missiles, ballistic systems, Shahed-type one-way attack drones, decoys, electronic warfare disruption, and information operations designed to delay decision-making at the exact moment when speed matters most. NATO planners understand this well. That is why integrated air and missile defense, dispersal, camouflage, hardened shelters, and redundant command links matter so much. But the existence of those precautions also sends its own message. It tells Moscow that NATO is not preparing for abstract risk, it is preparing for contact. And once both sides begin building for contact, each additional defensive measure can be misread as an offensive enabler. Then comes the nuclear shadow. CSIS assessed that Moscow changed its nuclear doctrine in order to deter further Western support, lower the threshold for perceived threats to Russian sovereignty, and divide allies by forcing them to calculate risk differently. That matters because the new rhetoric is not appearing in isolation. It is arriving alongside debates over long-range strikes, future European troop deployments, and the credibility of post-war guarantees. A revised doctrine does not automatically signal imminent nuclear use. ISW has been clear that such threats are more likely part of a cognitive warfare campaign than a near-term launch sequence. But doctrine still matters because doctrine shapes signaling, and signaling shapes crisis behavior. Once nuclear language is normalized, every conventional move acquires a second meaning. This is the overnight change so many observers missed. The crisis is no longer about whether NATO is helping Ukraine. That question was answered long ago with artillery, Patriot batteries, tanks, and fighter jets. The crisis is now about whether NATO is transitioning from supplier to embedded guarantor. That shift is subtle on paper but enormous in strategy. Suppliers can pause, guarantors cannot. Suppliers can argue over packages, guarantors must think in terms of tripwires, retaliation ladders, and casualty thresholds. The moment that distinction becomes visible in Moscow, every rail junction, airfield, and storage site linked to a future deterrence mission enters a different category of risk. That is when a red line stops being propaganda and starts becoming a targeting framework. The future projection is where this story becomes even more serious. If European governments move ahead with a deterrence force inside Ukraine after any ceasefire, Russia will face three choices. It can tolerate the deployment and accept a Western military footprint it has spent years trying to prevent. It can intensify hybrid attacks, cyber pressure, sabotage, and long-range strikes around the edges while stopping short of direct NATO casualties. Or it can attempt a dramatic demonstration against infrastructure, logistics, or non-combat support elements to prove that its red line still exists. None of those options is stable. All of them push Europe into a higher-risk era. And if the force never deploys, the consequences are also severe. Ukraine could be left with guarantees too weak to prevent renewed Russian coercion. The Kremlin could conclude that nuclear rhetoric and escalation threats still work. Other adversaries would study the result closely. They would learn that alliance cohesion can be strained not only by tanks and missiles, but by uncertainty, sabotage, and the careful manipulation of fear. In that sense, the battle over one red line in Ukraine is already larger than Ukraine. It is a test of whether 21st century coercion can redraw borders without formally defeating alliances. So when the next statement comes out of Moscow, or the next surveillance image appears over the Baltic, or the next meeting in Brussels is described as merely defensive, the real question will not be whether NATO intended to cross a red line. The real question will be whether the line had already been crossed the moment the alliance began integrating Ukraine into its command logic, force planning, and long-term security design. Because once that process began, Putin's response was never going to be judged by rhetoric alone. It was always going to be judged by whether Europe believed him. And that is the contradiction at the center of this crisis. NATO's most careful defensive measures may now be producing the very escalatory optics they were meant to prevent. Russia's loudest threats may still be partly bluff, yet bluff repeated too many times can become a trap from which escalation feels like the only escape. The old belief was that distance could be maintained between supporting Ukraine and entering a direct NATO-Russia confrontation. The new reality is that the distance is shrinking, measured now in brigades, headquarters, target lists, and hours of warning time. Do you think NATO has already crossed the line that makes some form of direct confrontation with Russia more likely? Or is the Kremlin simply trying to frighten Europe into abandoning Ukraine at the final moment? The opening assumption was that the alliance could stop just short of Moscow's threshold. Tonight, that threshold looks less like a line on the map and more like a zone both sides are already entering from opposite directions. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, and don't forget to like our video. Presented by TGN, thank you for choosing us.